The lace scratched at Clara's collarbone, a fine, punishing web of white that felt more like a snare than an adornment. Outside the window of the small boarding house room, the town of Redemption baked under a relentless sun. Its single street a river of pale dust stirred by the occasional passage of a horse or wagon. Everything was the color of bone. The dirt, the clapboard buildings, the bleached-out sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lye soap and her mother's rosewater, a cloying sweetness that did nothing to mask the bitter taste at the back of Clara's throat. Her mother, Eleanor, fussed with a pearl button at her cuff, her fingers thin and trembling. "There now, Clara, you look a vision, a true bride." Eleanor's face was drawn. The skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, but her eyes held a feverish, desperate light. It was the same light Clara had seen in the eyes of a cornered doe once, just before the hunter's shot. Clara kept her expression placid, a carefully constructed mask of obedience she had perfected over 19 years. Her hands, resting in her lap, were balled so tightly her knuckles were white, beneath the stiff corset that cinched her waist and stole her breath. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Calm on the surface, a storm raging within. This was the way of her life. "Mr. Blackwood will be a very proud man today," her father, Thomas, said from the doorway. He did not look at her, but at the reflection of her in the warped mirror. His gaze was that of a merchant inspecting merchandise just before a sale. He was a man worn down by failure, his shoulders permanently stooped from the weight of bad harvests and worse debts. Silas Blackwood was his salvation, and Clara was the price. Silas Blackwood. The name itself was heavy, like a shovelful of wet earth. He was a rancher, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, with a domain of cattle and land that stretched to the horizon. He was also 40 years her senior, with a face like a rock slide and small, dark eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. He had buried 1 wife already. The town whispered she had been a frail thing, prone to accidents. She had fallen down the stairs. They said she had stumbled into a door. She had, in the end, simply wasted away from a sadness no doctor could name. Clara had felt his hand on the small of her back a week ago, a possessive, heavy weight that made her skin crawl. He had smiled, a grim slash in his graying beard, and told her she was a filly that needed a firm hand. He had said it in front of her father, who had merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the promise of cleared ledgers and a life free from the shame of poverty. This marriage was a transaction, a piece of business conducted between 2 men over a bottle of whiskey. Clara was the currency. Her mother's illness required medicines they could not afford, and her father's gambling debts had grown into a beast with claws and teeth. Silas Blackwood had offered to tame that beast. In exchange, he wanted a young wife, a decoration for his grand ranch house, a vessel to bear him an heir. He was buying her youth and her compliance. Her family was selling her future. "It is a good match," Eleanor murmured, avoiding her daughter's eyes as she straightened a fold in the ivory silk skirt. "He is a man of substance. You will want for nothing." Nothing except air, Clara thought. Nothing except the right to her own thoughts, her own body, her own soul. She had dreamed of being a schoolteacher, of saving enough money to move to a town with a real library and trees that grew green and lush. She had imagined a life quiet and small, but entirely her own. That dream was now a wisp of smoke, thin and gray, dissolving into the dusty air of the room. The final piece of her resolve crumbled that morning, just hours ago. She had gone to the mercantile for a spool of thread her mother had forgotten, and had overheard 2 of the townswomen talking in a hushed corner, their heads bent together like scheming crows. They fell silent when they saw her, but not before she heard the words. Same way his first one did, all bruises and sad eyes. Then, a shiver of fear in the other woman's reply. "Hush now. His men are everywhere. You know what he does to people who cross him." That was it. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a death sentence. The town would not help her. The sheriff drank Blackwood's whiskey, and the preacher ate at his table. They would turn their backs and talk of unfortunate accidents, just as they had with the first Mrs. Blackwood. Clara saw her own future reflected in the fate of that poor, forgotten woman. A life of silent terror, of flinching from a raised hand, of slowly, surely being erased. Her desperation became a living thing, a sharp, cold spike in her chest. She could not breathe. She could not marry that man. She could not die in his house. Returning to the boarding room, she had moved with a strange, dreamlike calm. She had allowed her mother to help her into the underdress and corset. She had sat still while her hair was pinned and braided. But all the while, a plan, raw and desperate, was forming in her mind. It was not a good plan. It was, perhaps, no plan at all, but a blind, instinctual bolt for freedom. The ceremony was to be at noon. At 10:30, her mother went downstairs to speak with the preacher's wife, and her father left for the saloon to share a final drink of relief with his friends. Clara was left alone. A vision in white, staring at the ghost in the mirror. She moved then, her actions swift and silent. The wedding dress came off, the fine silk and punishing lace falling into a heap on the floor. The corset followed, and she gasped as her lungs filled with air, a deep, shuddering breath of rebellion. She was left in her simple cotton chemise and drawers, the clothes of a girl, not a bride, over them. She pulled on her plainest wool stockings and her sturdiest walking boots, the ones with the worn leather soles. She grabbed the dark woolen cloak that hung by the door, a meager shield against the world. She took nothing else, no money, no food, no keepsake. Possessions were anchors, and she needed to be weightless. A glance out the back window showed a narrow alleyway leading away from the main street. It was her only path, with her heart in her throat. She slipped out the door, crept down the creaking back stairs, and stepped out into the alley. The sudden, fierce heat was a slap in the face. She pulled the hood of the cloak over her head, a pathetic disguise, and walked, not ran, toward the edge of town. Every footstep was a thunderclap in her ears. Every shadow seemed to hold one of Blackwood's men. She passed the blacksmith's forge, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. She passed the last mean little house with its scraggly chickens pecking in the dirt. And then, the town ended, just like that. Redemption gave way to the vast, brutal emptiness of the plains. The landscape was an enemy. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her head and shoulders. The ground was a cracked, thirsty expanse of hardpan and rock, studded with sagebrush and mesquite, whose thorns tore at the hem of her cloak and scratched her legs raw. There was no shade, no softness, no mercy. The horizon shimmered and danced, a cruel mirage of escape. She did not know where she was going, only that it was away. North, she thought. Just keep heading north. By late afternoon, her feet were bleeding inside her boots. Her throat was a desert, and a dizzying headache pulsed behind her eyes. The world was a blur of brown and pale blue. When night finally fell, it brought no relief. The temperature plummeted, and the thin cloak was no match for a cold that seeped into her bones. The vast, empty silence of the day was replaced by a chorus of yips and howls. Coyotes. Their voices were lonely and hungry, and she huddled behind a cluster of rocks, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small and invisible. She thought of strangers, of desperate men who rode these trails, men who would see a lone woman as prey. Fear was a constant, cold companion, second only to the gnawing ache of thirst. Back in Redemption, chaos had erupted. The discovery of the abandoned wedding dress sent a shockwave through the small community. Silas Blackwood's face had turned a dark, mottled red, his fury a palpable force. He did not see a frightened girl. He saw a stolen possession, an insult to his power. "She is hysterical," he bellowed in the saloon, his voice silencing all other noise. "The girl has lost her senses. Ungrateful child." Her father, his face pale and slack with terror, readily agreed. "Yes, hysterical, not in her right mind. She has always been delicate." A posse was formed within the hour. The sheriff, a man with a drooping mustache and a belly full of Blackwood's liquor, deputized a dozen riders. They were told to bring back the runaway bride. Blackwood stood on the steps of the hotel, his presence looming over the town. $50, he announced, his voice carrying down the dusty street. $50 for the man who finds her and brings her back to me. The sum was a fortune to most of the men there, enough to turn a simple search into a ruthless hunt. Caleb rode south, his horse, Buck, moving at a steady, ground-eating pace. He was a man who had made an art of being alone. The war had scoured something clean out of him, leaving behind a quiet, hollow space where noise and company used to be. He had served as a scout, living in the spaces between armies, reading the land for secrets. His life depended on silence and observation. Now, he rode cattle trails, finding the same solace in the vast, empty landscapes. He preferred the company of his horse and the stars to that of men. Grief was his shadow, a constant presence that clung to him like trail dust. He never spoke of the fiancée he had lost to a house fire, nor the younger brother he had watched hang for stealing a side of beef to feed their starving family. The memories were stones in his gut, heavy and permanent. He kept them to himself, wrapped in a thick blanket of silence. He was heading for a line shack in the foothills, a place to rest for a few days before taking a job driving a herd west. He was not looking for trouble. Trouble, however, was often indifferent to a man's preferences. He found her near a shallow, muddy creek, little more than a trickle of life in the parched land. At first, he thought she was a bundle of discarded rags. Then he saw the pale glint of a hand, the dark tangle of hair against the dirt. He dismounted, his movements economical and unhurried. She was a mess of scrapes and bruises, her lips cracked and swollen. Her cloak was shredded, and the thin cotton of her underdress was torn and stained with dirt and blood. She was barely conscious, but his approach stirred her. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with a terror so profound it made him pause. They were the eyes of a rabbit caught in a trap. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up with trembling arms. "No," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "Please." Caleb stopped, holding up a hand, palm out. He said nothing. He simply stood, letting the silence stretch, giving her time to see that he was not one of them, not one of the hunters. Tears streamed through the grime on her cheeks. "Please do not take me back," she begged, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "He will kill me. Please, I cannot go back." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the bloody feet, the wild fear in her eyes, the sheer, raw desperation of her. He had seen that look before, in the faces of men who had seen too much war. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only answer he offered. He unstrapped his canteen and knelt beside her, holding it to her lips. She drank greedily, choking and sputtering, but he held it steady. When she had had enough, he took the heavy wool blanket from the back of his saddle. It was old and smelled of wood smoke, horse, and the clean scent of the high plains. He unfolded it and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. Then, with a strength that surprised her, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He set her on the front of his saddle, her back against his chest, and mounted behind her. She was stiff with fear at first, but exhaustion was a stronger master. She sagged against him, the warmth of his body and the thick blanket a startling comfort. He nudged Buck with his heels, and they moved on, leaving the creek behind, heading away from the direction she had come. He did not speak a single word. They rode for hours, deeper into the rolling, empty hills. when the last light bled from the sky, leaving the world a canvas of deep indigo and silver starlight, he finally reined Buck to a halt in a small, sheltered basin. He built a small, smokeless fire with practiced efficiency, its low flames a welcome flicker of life in the immense, freezing darkness. He offered her a piece of jerky, which she chewed slowly, the tough, salty meat a shock to her system. She sat huddled in his blanket, watching him. He was a quiet man, his face all sharp angles and shadows in the firelight. There were scars on his hands and a faint, pale line that ran from his temple into his hairline. He moved with a purpose that was both calming and intimidating. He asked no questions. He offered no explanations. It was later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, that the sound came. It was faint at first, the distant, rhythmic beat of shod hooves on hard ground. Caleb's head snapped up. He was on his feet in an instant, his body tensed. He kicked dirt over the embers, extinguishing the last of the light. Clara's heart seized. The posse. They had found her. "Get down," he whispered, his first words to her. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. He pulled her to the ground behind a thick outcropping of rock. The sound of the riders grew louder. A man's voice, rough and impatient, carried on the thin, cold air. "She could not have gotten this far. We will check the ridge at dawn." They were close, too close. Clara could hear the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to swallow her whole. Caleb acted without hesitation. He pushed her flat against the cold earth and then covered her with his own body, pulling the heavy trail blanket over both of them. Suddenly, her world was darkness and the scent of dust and man. His weight was solid and real above her, a human shield. She was pressed between the unyielding ground and the unyielding stranger. His chest was hard against her back, and she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. She held her breath, her body rigid, listening. Boots crunched on the gravel, mere feet from where they lay hidden. "Nothing here," a voice grumbled. "Just rocks and shadows. Let us make camp back by the cottonwoods." Another man grunted in agreement. The footsteps receded. The sound of the horses faded, moving away into the night. Clara and Caleb remained frozen under the blanket. Two people pressed together in a shared, silent darkness. She could feel his breath, warm against her hair. For a long, terrifying moment, they did not move, barely breathing, their bodies intertwined in a desperate bid for invisibility. The posse was gone, but the intimacy of their hiding place remained, a strange, profound connection forged in fear and silence, under the vast and unforgiving canopy of the stars. The world returned in shades of gray and rose with the first light of dawn. Clara woke with a start, the memory of boots on gravel so sharp she thought she could still hear them. She was alone, the heavy blanket tucked around her. Caleb was gone. A fresh wave of panic washed over her, cold and sickening. He had left her. He had realized the danger she represented and had ridden off, leaving her to the wilderness and the men who hunted her. But then she saw him, a silhouette against the rising sun, standing on a nearby rise, watching the back trail. He was a statue of vigilance, a quiet guardian she did not understand. He had not abandoned her. He had been keeping watch while she slept. A feeling so foreign it took her a moment to name it, gratitude, warmed her chest. When he was satisfied, the way was clear. He returned. He gave her the last of the water and another piece of jerky before lifting her onto his horse. They rode for another hour as the sun climbed, painting the foothills in hues of ochre and pale gold. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of dust and pine. The line shack was little more than a crude box of weathered wood tucked into a fold of the hills, nearly invisible against the rock and scrub. It had a sod roof, a single window with no glass, and a door that hung crookedly on leather hinges. Inside, it was sparse and smelled of old smoke and mice, There was a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot built into the wall, its mattress stuffed with dry grass. For Clara, who had spent the last 2 nights on the frozen ground, it was a palace. Caleb did not speak. He gestured for her to sit on the cot, and she obeyed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. He moved with that same silent efficiency she had seen the night before. He built a fire in the hearth, coaxing a flame from a handful of dry tinder. He took 2 buckets and disappeared, returning with one full of clear water from a hidden spring and the other with a collection of green, leafy plants. He set a small pot of water to boil over the fire. Clara watched him, her fear warring with a desperate need to trust. He was a complete stranger, a man of scars and silence. He could be anyone, an outlaw, a drifter with ill intentions. Yet, he had hidden her, warmed her, and brought her to this place of shelter. He had not hurt her. He had not even asked for her name. Every instinct that had screamed at her to run from Silas Blackwood was quiet in this man's presence. She was still afraid, but the terror was no longer a wild animal clawing at her insides. It had become a watchful stillness, an uncertainty that left room for a sliver of hope. He tended to her feet first. He gently removed her ruined boots and soaked her scraped, blistered feet in a basin of warm water. Clara flinched at his touch, a reflexive, ingrained response to any man's hands. He paused, his gaze meeting hers for a brief second. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement of her fear. He worked more slowly then, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cuts and applied a poultice made from the herbs he had gathered. The green paste was cool and soothing against her raw skin. While she rested, he took her boots. He worked by the firelight, his scarred hands moving with patient skill. He trimmed the torn leather, restitched a seam with a needle and thread from his saddlebag, and worked tallow into the dried-out hide until it was supple again. He was revealing nothing of himself. Yet these small, practical acts of kindness told her more than words ever could. He was a man who fixed what was broken. The physical recovery began its slow work. The warmth of the fire leached the deep cold from her bones. The food he prepared, a simple stew of dried beans and salted pork, filled her belly and quieted the gnawing hunger. Sleep, when it came, was deep and dreamless. The first true rest she had had in days. But the wounds to her spirit were not so easily mended. She would wake with a gasp, her heart pounding. The phantom feel of Silas Blackwood's heavy hand on her shoulder. The shame of her family's bargain was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was a runaway, an ungrateful daughter, a piece of property that had dared to have a will of its own. On the 3rd night, the storm inside her finally broke. The wind howled outside the little shack, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the desolation in her soul. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only sound in the small room. "They think I am hysterical," she said, her voice small and tight. Caleb did not stop his work, but she knew he was listening. The words began to spill out then, a torrent of confession she could no longer hold back. "My father, he owed Mr. Blackwood money, a lot of money. My mother is sick. She needs a doctor from the city. And medicines." She looked down at her hands, twisting the rough fabric of the blanket. "It was a trade. My father's debts for me. He sold me." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical sickness. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for, she did not know what, understanding, absolution. She expected to see disgust in his face, the same judgment she saw in her own reflection. A woman's worth was in her purity, her obedience. She had failed on both counts. She was ruined goods. "He had a first wife," she whispered, the secret she had overheard in the mercantile burning her tongue. The women in town said he was cruel to her, that she was always covered in bruises before she died. No one would do anything. No one would say a word. He owns the town, the sheriff, everything. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. I could not marry him. I could not let that be my life. So I ran. She finished, her story laid bare between them. She waited for his verdict, for him to tell her she was a fool, or a sinner, or a burden he now had to bear. Caleb set down his knife and the whetstone. He stood, went to the fire, and poured a tin cup of coffee from the pot that was always simmering there. He walked over and held it out to her. His face was unreadable in the flickering light, his eyes dark pools of shadow. He said nothing, not a word of pity, not a word of condemnation. He simply offered her coffee and the continued safety of his small fire. His silence was a gift. It did not judge her, nor did it try to fix her. It simply made space for her pain to exist. For the first time since she had fled redemption, Clara felt a sense of profound relief. She was not alone with her terrible story anymore. She had given it to the quiet man, and he had accepted it without question, without recoil. He had simply accepted it, and her, as they were. Later that night, long after she had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the cot, Caleb sat by the dying fire, his own ghosts stirring in the darkness. The girl's story had unsettled the stones of grief in his gut, the ones he worked so hard to keep buried. He remembered Annabelle, her laughter like the sound of a spring thaw, her hair the color of corn silk. They had been saving to buy a small piece of land, a place with a creek and cottonwood trees. He had been away, scouting for the army, when the letter found him, a stray ember from the hearth, a house of dry timber. Gone, all of it turned to smoke and ash. He had returned to a blackened patch of ground and a silence so complete it had hollowed him out. After that, the war had seemed less a duty and more a fitting penance. He had courted danger, welcoming the numbness that came with exhaustion and fear. He had survived, but the part of him that knew how to build a life with someone had burned away with that house. He thought of his younger brother, Jacob, all of 16 and with a hunger that was a constant ache in his belly. The war had been hard on those left behind. Jacob had been caught stealing a side of beef from a wealthy landowner's smokehouse. The landowner was also the judge. Caleb had stood in the dusty courtroom, his uniform still on, and listened as his brother was sentenced to hang. He had begged, offered to pay, offered to take his brother's place, but the law was a cold, impartial machine, especially when the poor stole from the rich. He had watched Jacob die at the end of a rope, his own hands clenched into useless fists. He had learned then that justice and law were often two entirely different things. He looked over at the sleeping girl, her face softer in repose, the lines of fear smoothed away. She was like Jacob, condemned by circumstances she could not control. She was like Annabelle, a life threatened by the careless cruelty of the world. His instinct to protect her was fierce and absolute, a raw, untamed thing that rose from the deepest, most wounded part of him. 2 days later, their supplies were running low. Caleb knew he had to risk a trip to a distant trading post, a place far from the search parties. He left Clara with a loaded pistol and a warning not to open the door for anyone. The trading post was a hive of gossip. As he bartered for flour and beans, he listened to the talk of a trapper who had just come from the south. The man spoke of a runaway bride from a town called Redemption. "The reward is $100 now," the trapper said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the stove. "The groom, Blackwood, is a man of means, and he is furious. The sheriff has declared the girl unstable, prone to wild fancies. Says she was likely kidnapped by some low-life drifter." Another man chimed in. "I heard different. I heard she was a sly one. Had a lover on the side and the two of them planned the whole thing. They say she led him on, then ran off with him the morning of the wedding." The trapper nodded eagerly. "That is the story they are telling now, that she is no victim, but a seductress, a Jezebel who tempted a good man to his ruin and stole a horse. They have a warrant out for him. 2. kidnapping and horse theft. Caleb's blood ran cold. They were twisting the story, turning the victim into the villain. They were not just trying to get her back, they were destroying her name, ensuring that no one would help her, that every hand would be turned against her. And now, they were hunting him, too. He returned to the shack just after nightfall, his face grim. He told her what he had heard. His words clipped and devoid of emotion, but she could feel the weight behind them. The news shattered Clara's fragile sense of safety. She began to weep, silent, despairing tears that tracked paths through the dust on her cheeks. "This is my fault," she whispered, her body trembling. "They are hunting you because of me. You will be hanged." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "I have to go. I have to keep running, alone. If they find me with you—" "No," he said. It was not a command, but a simple statement of fact. "But they will kill you," she cried. "You have to let me go." He looked at her then, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You do not have to run anymore." That night, the cold was deeper than ever, a biting, relentless thing that found its way through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire offered little comfort. Clara lay on the cot, shivering uncontrollably under her thin blanket. Caleb was on the floor near the hearth, but she could see that he was cold, too. After a long, silent hour, he stood up and brought his own thick trail blanket over to her cot. He did not get on it, but lay down on the floor right beside it, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He pulled his blanket over both of them, creating a shared pocket of warmth against the immense cold of the night. They lay there in the darkness, side by side, not touching, but separated by mere inches. It was a tender but restrained gesture, an act of practical necessity that felt profoundly intimate. She could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet room. She was acutely aware of him, of his strength, of the safety he had offered her without condition. Her despair and loneliness were a vast, cold ocean inside her. In the darkness, overwhelmed by fear for him and by the crushing weight of her own situation, she reached out her hand, a small, hesitant movement under the heavy blanket. Her fingers brushed against his. He did not pull away. Instead, his hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her own. He did not squeeze or caress. He simply held on. It was a silent promise in the dark, an anchor against the storm. And for the first time, Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, she would not be swept away. The decision was made without discussion, the morning after they had held hands in the dark. Caleb kicked dirt over the fire and said, "We leave at first light." He did not ask her where she wanted to go. He simply informed her of the plan. "There is a mining camp, north in the high country, Jasper Creek. They do not ask a man his name there, so long as his coin is good or his back is strong. A place to disappear, a place to start over." It was more than Clara had dared to hope for. He had found a second horse, a scrawny but steady mare, tethered at an abandoned homestead miles back. He was a man who knew how to find things the world had lost. For the first few days, he had Clara ride the mare while he walked, his hand resting lightly on the bridle, leading her through the broken country. But as her strength returned, he taught her to guide the horse herself. He showed her how to sit the saddle, how to read the horse's ears, how to use the pressure of her knees to ask for a change in pace. Slowly, a transformation began to take place in Clara. The terror that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a sharp, focused awareness of the world around her. She was no longer a passenger in her own escape. She was an active participant. She rode beside him now, not behind him. She learned to see the land not as a terrifying void, but as a map of secrets. Caleb pointed out the V-shaped track of a deer, the deeper, rounded print of a cougar, the subtle signs of water hidden in a line of willows. He taught her which berries were safe to eat and which roots could be boiled to make a bitter but nourishing tea. The world, which had seemed an enemy, began to reveal a harsh and startling beauty. She saw a hawk ride an updraft, its wings spread against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She watched a herd of wild mustangs flow like a river across a distant mesa. She tasted coffee, real coffee, boiled over a campfire, gritty with grounds and smoky from the flames. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted, for the first time in her life. She felt the sun on her face and the wind in her hair not as punishments, but as proof that she was alive, that she was free. The girl who had sat placidly in a stuffy boarding house room, waiting for her life to be decided for her, was fading. In her place, a new woman was emerging, one forged by hardship and necessity. One afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw it below them in a shallow valley, the skeleton of a homestead. The cabin was a collection of skeletal timbers, reaching to the sky like charred black fingers. The stone chimney stood alone, a grim monument to a life that had been violently erased. A rusted plow lay on its side in a field of weeds, and the faint outline of a garden was slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Clara reined in her mare, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The image of the burned house was a physical manifestation of her deepest fears, of violence, of destruction, of a home becoming a tomb. She began to tremble, the reins shaking in her hands. She thought of Silas Blackwood, of the whispers about his first wife, of the casual cruelty she had seen in his eyes. This, she thought, this is what men like him do. They burn everything they cannot own. Caleb stopped beside her, his gaze fixed on the ruin. His face, usually a mask of calm impassivity, was tight with a pain so old and deep it seemed carved into the lines around his eyes. "What happened here?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. He was silent for a long time, the wind whistling softly through the tall grass. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, dredged up from a place of profound sorrow. "A fire," he said, his eyes never leaving the blackened stones. "Just like this one." He did not need to say more. The story was there in the starkness of his words, in the raw grief that radiated from him like a killing frost. His fiancée, the woman he had lost. Clara's heart ached for him, for this quiet, wounded man who carried a ruin inside himself that mirrored the one below them. In that moment, she understood that he was not just a protector. He was a fellow survivor, a man who knew the landscape of loss as intimately as he knew these hills. That night, the mood around the campfire was somber. The image of the burned homestead hung between them, a shared, unspoken ghost. They sat closer than usual. The silence, not one of peace, but of shared sorrow. When it was time to sleep, they laid their bedrolls side by side without a word. The cold of the high country was sharp, and the practical need for warmth was an easy excuse for a closeness they both craved. Lying in the darkness, listening to the lonely cry of a distant wolf, Clara felt the weight of his grief as if it were her own. She turned on her side to face him. He was just a shadow, a presence in the dark, but she could feel his stillness, the tight control he kept over the storm inside him. Hesitantly, she reached out and laid a hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath the rough fabric of his shirt. He did not pull away. He simply lay there, allowing her touch, emboldened. She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. He smelled of smoke and leather and the clean, wild scent of the plains. He felt solid, real, a bastion against the ghosts of the past and the fears of the future. He shifted slightly, his arm coming around her, pulling her against his side. It was a gesture of comfort, not of passion. She lifted her head, and in the faint starlight, she could just make out the sharp line of his jaw, the dark shape of his eyes. He was looking down at her, his expression unreadable. She leaned in, slowly, giving him every chance to turn away. He did not. Their lips met. The kiss was slow, hesitant, and profoundly sad. It was not a kiss of romance, but of communion. It tasted of wood smoke and unshed tears. It was the scratch of his unshaven jaw against her cheek, the gentle pressure of his mouth, a silent conversation without words, a shared acknowledgement of all the things they had lost and the fragile, uncertain thing they were building here in the wilderness. One day at a time. When they finally broke apart, they did not speak. He simply held her, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt completely alone. They reached a trader's post a few days later, a solitary building squatting in the vast emptiness, a lifeline for trappers and travelers. Caleb went in first, leaving Clara with the horses. He came out a few minutes later and motioned for her to follow. The post was a dim, crowded space that smelled of cured hides, tobacco, and unwashed men. Two grizzled prospectors looked up as she entered, their eyes lingering on her long, dark hair. Clara pulled her cloak tighter, her skin crawling under their gaze. While Caleb traded for flour, coffee, and ammunition, Clara's eyes fell upon a notice nailed to a wooden support beam. It was a wanted poster. Her heart stopped. The sketch was a poor likeness, a cruel caricature that made her look wild-eyed and sly. But it was unmistakably her. Beneath it, the words were a physical blow. Wanted, the runaway bride. Reward, $100. The text described her as Clara May Thompson, a ward of Mr. Silas Blackwood, who had fallen into a state of mental distress and fled her home. It warned that she was unstable, prone to hysterics, and should be considered dangerous. The lies were so brazen, so complete, they stole her breath. They had not just hunted her, they had erased her, replacing the real Clara with a madwoman of their own invention. Panic seized her. She felt the walls of the small post closing in. She had to get out. She had to change. When Caleb finished his business, she pulled him outside, her hands trembling. "Did you see it?" she whispered frantically. He nodded, his face grim. "I saw it." "My hair," she said, her thoughts racing. "It is too recognizable." She looked at him, a desperate plea in her eyes. "Your knife." He understood immediately. He pulled the long hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. He did not question her or try to talk her out of it. He simply handed it to her. Handle first. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began to saw at the thick braid that hung down her back. The blade was sharp, and the hair fell away in a great, dark rope. She hacked at the remaining strands, her movements clumsy and fierce, until her hair was a short, jagged mess that barely touched her collar. It was the act of a desperate woman, an act of defiance. She was no longer the girl with the beautiful, long hair her mother had been so proud of. She was someone else now, someone they would not recognize. She looked at the dark coil of hair on the ground, a severed piece of her old life, and felt a strange, fierce sense of liberation. They rode on, pushing deeper into the mountains. A storm was brewing in the west, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind turned cold and began to carry the scent of rain. Within an hour, the sky opened up. Rain fell in cold, driving sheets, turning the trail to mud. A flash of lightning lit up the landscape, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Through the deluge, Caleb spotted it, a small, abandoned cabin, barely more than a hovel, built into the side of a hill. They urged their tired horses toward it, their clothes soaked through, their bodies shivering with cold. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, but it was dry. They built a fire in the hearth, the small flame a defiant cheer against the raging storm outside. The confined space felt charged, the air thick with unspoken words, the fear from the trading post, the intimacy of their kiss, the violence of the storm. It all combined to wear away the last of Clara's defenses. She paced the small dirt floor like a caged animal, the jagged ends of her shorn hair brushing against her neck. Caleb watched her, his silence an invitation. He knew something was pressing on her, a truth even deeper and more painful than the one she had already confessed. Finally, she stopped in front of him, her face pale and strained in the firelight. The poster, it said I was unstable, she began, her voice trembling. They will say I am a liar, that I imagined it all. I do not think you are a liar, he said quietly. Her composure broke. A raw, ragged sob escaped her lips. There is more, she choked out. Something else I did not tell you. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her broken pieces together. Mr. Blackwood, he did not wait, she whispered, the words so painful she could barely force them out. He did not wait for the wedding night, the night he and my father made their final agreement. He came to my room. He said he wanted to be sure he was getting what he paid for. The ugly, terrible secret was out, lying in the small space between them. It was the deepest source of her shame, the ultimate violation. In the eyes of the world, it made her worthless, a fallen woman. I was not pure, she wept, the words torn from the depths of her soul. He took that, too. That is why I had to run. I could not stand before the preacher, before God, and pretend. I could not belong to him after that. She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs, expecting him to turn away in disgust. This was the final truth that would surely make him abandon her. But Caleb did not move away. He did the opposite. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort or promises of vengeance. He simply reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. It was not the hold of a savior comforting a victim. It was the hold of an equal, a fellow soul who understood that some wounds are too deep for words. He was not trying to fix her. He was just seeing her, all of her, the broken parts and the strong ones. And he was not turning away. He was holding her as if she were something precious, not something ruined. Later, when her tears were spent, they sat before the fire, wrapped in a shared blanket. The storm still raged outside, but inside their small shelter, a profound quiet had fallen. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a small, grounding gesture. The space between them was no longer filled with secrets, but with a raw, painful honesty. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. She felt a longing so deep it was an ache, a longing not for passion, but for connection, for a safe harbor in the storm of her life. He seemed to feel it, too. He tilted her chin up, his gaze searching hers in the firelight. This time, when he kissed her, it was different. There was no sadness in it, only a quiet, desperate need. It was a kiss of shared pain, of mutual longing, a silent promise to shelter each other from the cold. They clung to each other, 2 broken people finding a fragile wholeness in the dark, a shelter made not of wood and stone, but of skin and bone and a shared, unspoken understanding. In the morning, the storm had passed. The world was washed clean, the air fresh and cold. A fragile peace settled over Clara. She felt lighter. The terrible secret was no longer hers alone to carry. Caleb opened the cabin door to let in the morning light, and then he froze. Clara came to stand beside him, lying on the muddy ground. Not 10 feet from their door was a man. He was a stranger in a dusty coat, his face turned to the sky, his eyes open and unseeing. There was a single, dark hole in his chest. He was dead, and in his cold, stiff hand, he was still clutching a crumpled, rain-soaked piece of paper, her wanted poster. The posse was no longer just a distant threat. They were here, and they were closing in. The sight of the dead man rooted them to the spot. The morning air, so clean and promising moments before, now felt heavy with the stench of death and imminent danger. Caleb moved first, his body a study in grim efficiency. He knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the man's clothes, his boots, the angle of his fall. There was no emotion on his face, only a cold, hard calculation. He was a bounty man, Caleb said, his voice low and flat. Not from the posse. A lone hunter, tracking us for the reward. He looked up at the surrounding hills, his gaze sweeping across the ridges, searching for any sign of movement. He was not alone. They sent a scout. The others are not far behind. The fragile peace Clara had felt shattered into 1,000 pieces. The world was once again a trap, and they were the prey. Caleb stood, his decision already made. "You will take the mare," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Ride north, hard and fast. Do not stop until you reach Jasper Creek. I will take Buck and lead them south. They are after me as much as you now. I can give you a day's head start, maybe more." He was offering to sacrifice himself, to draw the wolves away from her. He was giving her the only thing he had left to give, a chance. A week ago, she would have taken it. She would have run, just as she had run from redemption. A frightened girl propelled by pure survival instinct. But she was not that girl anymore. The wilderness and the quiet man standing before her had changed her. She had been saved, yes, but she had also been forged. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mountains around them. Caleb turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and impatience. "Clara, this is not a discussion. It is the only way." "No," she repeated, stepping closer, her chin lifted. She met his gaze without flinching. "I am tired of running. I am tired of being the reason someone else is in danger. You found me half dead and gave me shelter. You have protected me and fed me and kept me warm. I will not repay you by abandoning you to face them alone." "You are not abandoning me," he argued, his voice tight with urgency. "You are surviving. That is the goal." "It is not my only goal anymore," she said, and she felt a strength in her she had never known she possessed. "My whole life, men have decided my fate. My father, Silas Blackwood. They told me where to go, who to be, what to accept. You are the first man who has given me a choice, and my choice is to stay with you. We ride north together, or we do not ride at all." He stared at her, truly seeing her. Perhaps for the first time, he was not looking at a fragile runaway bride, but at a woman with a will of iron. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw, and in that moment, he knew he could not change her mind, and a part of him, a part he had thought long dead, did not want to. He gave a single, sharp nod. The argument was over. They did not bother to bury the dead man. The wilderness would claim its own. They rode hard, pushing the horses into the high country, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous. They followed game trails and creek beds, avoiding the open paths where they could be easily spotted. The air grew thin and cold, and the mountains rose around them like jagged gray teeth. They spotted the riders late in the afternoon, 3 of them, silhouetted against the skyline on a ridge a mile behind. The posse. They had found their trail. "There is a pass ahead," Caleb said, his voice calm, but his eyes were alert, missing nothing. "It is narrow. We might be able to lose them in the rocks." The pass was a deep slash in the mountain, a bottleneck with sheer rock walls on either side. It was their only way through. They entered it at a gallop, the horses' hooves striking sparks on the stones. The sound of the pursuit grew louder behind them, the shouts of men echoing off the canyon walls. The first gunshot was a sharp crack that ripped through the air. A bullet whined past Clara's head. So close, she felt its heat. She cried out, her body instinctively flinching. The mare shied, nearly throwing her. "Keep riding," Caleb yelled, pulling his own revolver from its holster. He twisted in his saddle and fired a shot back, not aiming to hit, but to slow them down. The pass narrowed further, the trail littered with fallen rocks and scree. It became a shooting gallery. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, sending chips of stone flying, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Clara bent low over the mare's neck, her heart hammering against her ribs, her world reduced to the thundering of hooves and the terrifying crack of rifles. She saw Caleb wince, his body jolting in the saddle. A dark stain was spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. "Caleb!" she screamed. He gritted his teeth, his face pale. "It is just a graze. Keep moving." But he was already slowing. His reins held loosely in one hand. One of the riders behind them, a big man on a bay horse, saw his chance. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance, raising his rifle for a clear shot. There was no time to think. There was only instinct. Clara remembered the pistol Caleb had given her, the one tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Her hand closed around the cold, heavy grip. She pulled it free, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She had never fired a gun in her life. She reined the mare in sharply, turning her just enough to see the man. He was taking aim at Caleb's back. She lifted the pistol with both hands, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil jarring her arms all the way to her shoulders. She did not know where the bullet went, but the man on the bay horse ducked, his own shot going wide, plowing into the dirt. The momentary distraction was all Caleb needed. He fired again, and this time the big man cried out, clutching his arm and falling back. The other two riders reined in, taking cover behind a cluster of boulders. The chase was over. For now. "Go!" Caleb gasped, his face beaded with sweat. "Now! Clara!" She did not need to be told twice. She spurred the mare forward, grabbing the reins of Caleb's horse. "Buck!" She led them out of the pass and into a dense forest of pine and aspen on the other side. They rode until the horses were lathered and gasping, until the sounds of the posse were completely gone, swallowed by the immense silence of the mountains. Caleb was slumping in the saddle, his face ashen. The dark stain on his shirt had grown, and blood was dripping from his fingertips. He was losing blood, and fast. "We have to stop," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. She found what she was looking for a few hundred yards later. A shallow cave, little more than a dark fissure in a rock face, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown brush. It was small and damp, but it was shelter. She helped him dismount. He leaned on her heavily, his legs unsteady. She half dragged, half carried him into the cave and eased him down to the floor, his back against the cold stone wall. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a wounded man whose life depended entirely on her. The old Clara would have dissolved into helpless tears. The obedient, silent girl who had been raised to wait for a man to solve her problems would have been useless. That girl was a ghost. Clara took a deep breath, pushing the fear down. She knew what she had to do. First, the wound. She gently cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow across the top of his shoulder, a deep and ugly gash that was still weeping blood. It needed to be cleaned and bandaged. She used the last of their clean water and a strip of her own chemise to wash the wound, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He groaned, his body tense with pain, but he did not open his eyes. Then, she took the long cotton of her underskirt and began to tear it into long strips. As her hands worked, her mind drifted back. She remembered her father, a man whose word was law in their small house. A woman's place is to be seen, not heard. Clara, he had told her countless times, your opinions are unbecoming. She remembered her mother, teaching her to stitch and cook, but never to read the books she truly loved. A man wants an agreeable wife. Dear, she would say, not a clever one. Her dream of being a schoolteacher had been a quiet, secret thing, nurtured in the pages of borrowed books. She had saved a few precious coins, hoping to one day attend a normal school in the East. When she had finally gathered the courage to tell her father, he had laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive sound. School. What does a girl need with school? Your business is to marry, and to marry well. I have already made inquiries. That had been the day her dream died. It had also been the day she learned that her life was not her own to command. She had been taught to be silent, to be obedient, to be agreeable. She had been taught to be a vessel, waiting to be filled by a husband's needs and desires. She looked at the strips of cloth in her hands, stained with Caleb's blood. She looked at the man lying pale and still before her. All that training and obedience had not prepared her for this. Survival had the harsh reality of the wilderness, and the quiet strength of this man had taught her more about her own capabilities in 2 weeks than 19 years of genteel instruction ever had. She was not just a runaway, she was a survivor, and she would keep him alive. She bound the wound tightly, creating a thick pad to stanch the bleeding. She covered him with both of their blankets, huddling close to him, sharing her own body heat to fight off the shock and the cold of the cave. For hours, she sat with him in the dim light, wiping his brow when the fever came, whispering to him when he muttered in his delirium. She kept him alive. He woke late that night. The cave was pitch black, but she knew the moment he was conscious. His breathing changed, deepened. "Clara," he whispered, his voice weak. "I am here," she said softly, her hand finding his in the darkness. He was quiet for a long time. "You saved me," he said finally. "You fired the shot." "You would have done the same for me," she answered. His hand tightened on hers. "This is my fault," he rasped. "I have dragged you into my world. This is all I am good for. Clara, running and hiding, surviving. It is all I know. I do not know how to love. I do not know how to build a life. Everything I have ever tried to build has turned to ash." His confession was a raw, painful thing, the admission of a man who believed he was fundamentally broken. He saw himself as a force of destruction, a man who could only lead her to ruin. Clara felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away, a fierce, protective love for this wounded, self-doubting man. She moved closer, her voice firm and clear in the darkness. "Listen to me, Caleb," she said. "You are wrong. You think you are only good at surviving, but you taught me how to live. Out here, with you. I have felt more alive than I ever did in that town. You did not drag me into your world. You gave me a world I never knew existed, a world where I can be strong." She leaned over him, her face close to his. "And you do not have to save me anymore. I am not that frightened girl you found by the creek. I am not running from Silas Blackwood. I am running to something. With you, I am here because I choose to be here. I choose you." His breath hitched. In the darkness, he lifted a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, her shorn hair. It was a touch full of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. She leaned down and kissed him. This kiss was nothing like the ones before. It was not born of sorrow or desperation. It was born of a choice, clear-eyed and absolute. It was a kiss of full honesty, a raw and passionate claiming. It was the desire of two people who had seen the worst in the world and in each other's pasts, and had decided to face it together. Their bond, forged in the crucible of survival, was finally tempered into love. 2 days later, Caleb was strong enough to ride. His shoulder was a fiery agony, but he bore it with his usual stoicism. As they prepared to leave, a lone prospector, leading a stubborn mule, stumbled upon their camp. He was an old man with a beard like a tumbleweed and kind eyes. He shared his coffee and his news. "Best be careful up this way," he said, squinting at Caleb's bandaged shoulder. "Sheriff from down south, town called Redemption, has put out a new poster, offering $200 now for the girl and the man who took her." He pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag. It was a new warrant. It named Caleb by name, calling him a kidnapper, a horse thief, and a known criminal. It went on to state that Mr. Silas Blackwood had filed legal charges. Says the pair of you are trespassing on his land, the old man explained, pointing vaguely at the mountains around them. Claims he owns this whole stretch of country. Says the law will see you both hanged. The net had tightened. They were no longer just runaways. They were fugitives from a law that had been bought and paid for, trapped on land owned by the very man they were trying to escape. Their fragile hope now faced its most dangerous enemy yet, the long, corrupt arm of the law. Jasper Creek was not a town. It was a wound in the earth. It clung to the side of a mountain, a chaotic jumble of canvas tents, raw timber shacks, and a few two-story false-front buildings that leaned against each other for support. The single street was a river of mud, churned by the boots of 100 miners and the hooves of their weary mules. The air was thick with the smells of pine smoke, blasting powder, and cheap whiskey. It was a place built on the feverish hope of striking it rich and the grim reality of back-breaking labor. People from every corner of the world had washed up here. Irishmen with haunted eyes, Chinese laborers in loose-fitting blue coats who kept to themselves, weathered prospectors who spoke to their mules more than to men. The anonymity they had sought was here, but it was a nervous, distrustful kind of anonymity. Men did not ask questions because they did not want to be asked any in return. Prejudice was a current that ran just beneath the surface, a quiet poison in a town too busy digging for gold to start a proper war. For Clara, who had known only the vast, clean silence of the wilderness for weeks, the noise and the crowds were a physical assault. She walked close to Caleb, her hand resting on the back of his belt, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of humanity. Caleb was different here, too. The calm, watchful stillness he wore in the wild was replaced by a coiled tension. His eyes were constantly moving, assessing every shadow, every drunken shout. This was a different kind of wilderness, with different predators. They found a small room to rent above the laundry, a space so tiny they could not both stand at the same time. But it had a door that locked and a mattress that was not the cold, hard ground. For 3 days, they barely left it, resting, healing, and listening to the life of the town flow beneath them. Caleb's shoulder was mending, but he was still weak. Their money was running out. Clara knew she could not hide forever. She was a partner, not a passenger. On the 4th day, she saw a sign scrawled on a piece of wood outside the saloon, a noisy, rough establishment called the Gilded Cage. The sign read, "Woman wanted for serving and cleaning." "I can do that," she told Caleb, her voice more confident than she felt. He looked at her, his expression grim. "That is a rough place." "Clara." "We need money," she said simply. "I am not afraid of work." He did not argue. But when she went downstairs, he followed, taking a seat at a corner table in the saloon, his back to the wall, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He was a silent, brooding guardian, and his presence gave her the courage she needed. The tavern owner, a large man with a stained apron and a cynical squint, hired her on the spot. The work was hard. She hauled buckets of dirty water, scrubbed grime from the floorboards, and served plates of greasy stew and glasses of frothing beer to loud, coarse men. They stared at her, their eyes hungry and assessing. Her shorn hair and plain dress did little to deter them, but with Caleb watching from his corner, they kept their distance. Until one man did not. He was a freight driver, passing through, a man with a fleshy face and small, mean eyes. He had been staring at her all evening. As she reached to clear his table, he grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "I know you," he slurred, his breath sour with beer. "I saw your picture on a poster down in the flats. You are that runaway bride, the crazy one." Clara tried to pull her arm free, her blood turning to ice. "You are mistaken, sir." He laughed, a loud, ugly sound that drew the attention of the entire room. "Oh, I am not mistaken." He yanked her closer, his face inches from hers. "They say you ran off with some killer. Is that him over there in the corner?" The one who looks like he would gut a man for a nickel? He raised his voice for the benefit of the other patrons. This here is that famous Jezebel from Redemption. What is the reward up to now? $200? Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Clara. Every eye in the room was on her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. She was a spectacle, a freak to be gawked at. The man's words, the lies from the poster, were stripping her bare, branding her in front of this room full of strangers. "Let go of me," she said, her voice a low, trembling command. He only tightened his grip, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Or what? You gonna have one of your hysterics?" He never saw Caleb move. One moment, Caleb was in the corner. The next, he was there. He did not say a word. His hand clamped down on the freight driver's shoulder, and he spun the man around, away from Clara. Caleb's face was a blank mask of fury. The freight driver, seeing the look in his eyes, made a fatal mistake. He swung a clumsy, drunken fist. Caleb moved with a speed that was terrifying. He broke the man's arm with a short, sharp twist that made a sickening crack. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. Caleb did not stop. He hit him, once, twice, 3 times, his fists striking with the force of rocks. The freight driver fell to the floor, and Caleb fell on him. His control completely gone. He was no longer a quiet, patient man. He was the sum of all his grief and rage, a storm of violence that had finally been unleashed. The other men in the saloon scrambled back, their own drunken bravado forgotten in the face of such raw fury. The owner shouted, but made no move to intervene. Clara stood frozen, watching the man she loved nearly kill a man with his bare hands. She saw the war in him then, the scout who had seen and done terrible things to survive. She was the one who stopped him. She put her hand on his back, the one over the newly healed shoulder. "Caleb," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of his rage. "Caleb, that is enough." He stopped, his fist raised for another blow. He looked down at the bloody, unconscious man beneath him, and then up at her. The fury in his eyes receded, replaced by a dawning horror at what he had done. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, and pulled her toward the door. "We have to go," he rasped. "Now!" They fled into the night, leaving the chaos of the saloon behind them. They were fugitives once more, unable to return to their small room, unable to remain in Jasper Creek. Caleb knew of only one place to go. He led her away from the main camp, up a winding path to a small, isolated cabin on the mountainside, a place where the scent of medicinal herbs hung in the air. An old woman stood in the doorway, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her black hair streaked with silver and tied in 2 long braids. She was half crow, a healer the miners both feared and respected. She looked at Caleb, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "I remember you," she said, her voice low and raspy, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "From the war, the one they called the ghost. You had the same wound in your eyes then as you do now." Her name was Lena. She took them in without question, her dark, knowing eyes seeming to understand their situation completely. She gave them stew and hot tea. She looked at Clara, at the lingering shame and fear in her eyes. "The world is full of loud, foolish men," Lena said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Their noise means nothing. It is the quiet voices you must listen to, the voice of the mountain, the voice of your own heart." Over the next few days, Lena's cabin became a sanctuary. She gave Clara herbs to make a calming tea and a salve for the bruises the man had left on her wrist. She taught her about the plants that grew on the mountain, which ones healed and which ones poisoned. But her greatest medicine was her wisdom. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lena looked at Clara. "You cannot keep running forever," she said softly. "A soul needs to plant roots, or the wind will eventually tear it to pieces. Hiding is not living. It is just a slower way of dying." Lena's words struck a deep chord in Clara. She was right. She was tired of hiding. She was tired of letting Silas Blackwood and his lies define her. The incident in the tavern had shown her that his story would follow her wherever she went. A ghost she could not outrun. There was only one way to kill a ghost. You had to face it. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not be the runaway bride anymore. She would not be the hysterical woman on the poster. She would be Clara Mae Thompson, and she would tell her own story. "I need paper," she told Lena, "and ink." The old woman nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The truth is a powerful medicine," she said. Clara wrote through the night, the words pouring out of her in a torrent of pain and fury and truth. She wrote about her family's debt, about the bargain her father had made. She wrote about Silas Blackwood's cruelty, about the whispers of his first wife's fate. She wrote about the assault, the secret she had guarded so closely, laying the ugly truth bare for the world to see. She wrote about the town that had been too afraid to speak, about the sheriff who served a rich man instead of the law. It was a confession, an accusation, and a plea. Lena knew a man, a traveling journalist who rode a circuit between the mining camps and the eastern cities. A man who had a reputation for printing the stories no one else would touch. She gave the letter to a prospector she trusted, along with a few coins, to deliver it to the journalist in the next town over. Clara signed it only. A woman who will no longer be silent. Weeks passed. Life in Lena's cabin was quiet and peaceful. Caleb's soul began to heal from the violence he had unleashed. He spent his days chopping wood and hunting, the simple, physical tasks seeming to ground him. He and Clara settled into a rhythm, a domesticity that felt both strange and wonderful. They were partners in everything, from cooking meals to gathering herbs. The love between them deepened, no longer a desperate thing forged in flight, but a quiet, steady flame. News of the letter's impact arrived with a freight driver Lena traded with. The story had been published in a Denver newspaper and had made its way back to Redemption. It had caused an uproar. The anonymity of the letter made it impossible to dismiss outright. People were talking. Some were defending Blackwood's honor, but others, the ones who had harbored their own quiet suspicions for years, were beginning to question the official narrative. The foundation of lies was beginning to crack. The proof of that crack arrived in person a few days later. A young woman, her face pale with exhaustion, rode up to the cabin on a tired horse. Clara recognized her immediately. It was Mary, the daughter of the blacksmith in Redemption, a quiet girl with whom Clara had sometimes shared a stolen moment of conversation. "Clara," Mary cried, half falling from her horse. "I had to find you. I had to warn you." They brought her inside, gave her food and water. Mary told her story in a rush. Clara's letter had emboldened some of the women in town. They had started talking to each other, sharing stories of Blackwood's temper, of his cruelty. Mary had overheard her father talking to the sheriff. Blackwood was beyond furious. He had been publicly shamed, his power questioned for the first time. "He is not relying on the law anymore," Mary said, her eyes wide with fear. "He has gathered 12 men, hired guns from out of the territory. He is coming himself. Your letter made him look like a fool, and he aims to retrieve what he calls his property. He is not coming to arrest you, Clara. He is coming to bury his mistake, and you with it." The final confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. That night, the weight of the coming battle settled over the small cabin. Caleb took Clara outside, away from the cabin. Under the vast, star-dusted sky, he pressed a small, heavy leather pouch into her hand. It was filled with coins, all the money he had in the world. "There is a trail," he said, his voice low and steady. "It leads east, over the mountains. It is a hard ride, but it will take you to the territories. You can buy a ticket on a stagecoach. Change your name, start a new life, a safe life." He handed her the reins to the mare. "He is coming for me. Clara, not for you. This is my fight." She looked at the coins in her hand, at the horse, at the path to safety he was offering her. She looked at his face, at the lines of worry and love etched there. He was trying to save her, one last time. She closed her hand around the coins and held them out to him. "No," she said softly. She let the reins fall to the ground. "My home is not a place on a map. Caleb, it is beside you. I am not leaving." His shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. He pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair. "I was afraid you would say yes," he whispered. They walked to a small, quiet spot by the river that flowed down from the mountain, the water a ribbon of silver in the moonlight. They made a small camp, the final camp of their long run. Caleb turned to her, his face serious in the firelight. "Clara," he said, taking her hands in his, "I do not have anything to offer you. No land, no fine house, no name that is not on a wanted poster. All I have is a fight that we might not win." He paused, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands. "But I am asking you to stay, not as a runaway I found by a creek, not as someone broken who needs my help. I am asking you to be my partner, in this fight and in whatever comes after, to build a life with me, if we are given the chance." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of a deep, abiding joy. He was not proposing to a woman he had saved. He was proposing to his equal. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of all the love and certainty in her heart. Yes. He was not placing a ring on her finger. He was placing his life, his future in her hands. And she was accepting it, freely and completely. She was no longer a bride being sold to settle a debt. This time, she was a bride of her own choosing. They did not have to wait long. Dawn was a pale, uncertain line in the east when the riders appeared, dark shapes moving through the river mist. There were a dozen of them, led by a large man on a fine black horse whose arrogance was visible even from a distance. Silas Blackwood had come to collect his property. Caleb and Clara stood in the open, near the ashes of their small fire. It was not a hiding place, but a dueling ground of their own choosing. Caleb held a rifle, his stance relaxed but ready. Clara stood beside him, her hands empty, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve a bedrock beneath it. This was the end of the running. Blackwood and his men reined in their horses a stone's throw away, the animals stamping and blowing clouds of steam in the cold morning air. Blackwood's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes small and dark like chips of obsidian. He did not look at Caleb. His gaze was fixed on Clara, a look of pure, possessive rage. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, girl," he said, his voice a low growl that carried across the clearing. "And you, thief," he finally acknowledged Caleb, "you will hang for this, for stealing my horse, and for stealing what is mine." It was Clara who answered, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. "I am not yours," she said, taking a step forward. "I have never been yours. You did not buy a wife, Mr. Blackwood. You bought a prisoner, and I am no longer in my cell." A murmur went through Blackwood's hired men. They had come expecting to retrieve a hysterical girl, not to face a defiant woman. "You accuse this man of being a thief," Clara continued, her voice rising with passion. "But it is you who are the thief. You tried to steal my future. You tried to steal my voice. And you assaulted me in my room, the night our supposed bargain was struck. You are not a groom. You are a criminal." Blackwood's face turned a dark, mottled purple. The public accusation, in front of his men, was more than his pride could bear. "Lies!" he roared. "The ravings of a madwoman! Take them!" He reached for the pistol on his hip, and the world exploded into chaos. Caleb's rifle fired a split second before Blackwood's pistol cleared its holster. One of the hired guns cried out and tumbled from his saddle. Then the air was filled with a deafening roar of gunfire. Caleb dropped to one knee, firing and reloading with a calm, deadly precision that was terrifying to behold. He was no longer the quiet man who fixed boots and gathered herbs. He was the ghost, the scout who had survived a war, and he was fighting for the only thing he had left to live for. Clara threw herself to the ground, crawling behind a large boulder as bullets tore through the air around her. She was not a fighter, but she was not helpless. She became Caleb's eyes, her voice sharp and clear above the din. "Two on the right, by the riverbank. One is reloading." Caleb shifted, fired twice. Another man fell, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Caleb's shirt, grazing his arm. Another kicked up dirt just inches from his head. He was a single man against a small army. Then, the shot he could not dodge found its mark. A bullet from the side struck him high in the leg, shattering the bone. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and fell, his rifle clattering on the stones. "Caleb!" Clara screamed, her heart seizing with terror. Silas Blackwood saw his chance. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol to finish the man who had defied him. He would kill Caleb, and then he would take Clara. He would break her, just as he had broken his first wife, until all that was left was a silent, obedient shell. Clara scrambled out from behind the rock, her mind racing. The pistol Caleb had given her was gone, lost in the fall. She was defenseless, but she would not let him die. She ran, not away, but directly into the path of Blackwood's horse, waving her arms. A desperate, foolish, courageous act. "No!" she screamed. The horse shied at her sudden appearance, rearing up with a frightened whinny. Blackwood fought for control, cursing her. The momentary distraction was all Caleb needed. Lying on the ground, his leg a ruin of pain, he pushed himself up on one elbow. His revolver was still in his hand. He ignored the hired gun still firing from the trees. He ignored the fire in his leg. His vision narrowed until all he could see was the man who had tried to destroy the woman he loved. With the last of his strength, he raised the pistol, took aim, and fired. The shot was true. Silas Blackwood stiffened in his saddle, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He stayed upright for a long second, a statue of stunned arrogance, and then he toppled sideways, falling from his horse to land in the dirt with a heavy, final thud. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The hired guns, seeing their paymaster dead, lost their nerve. A few fired a last parting shot before turning their horses and melting back into the woods. The battle was over. Clara rushed to Caleb's side. He was unconscious, his face pale as death, a pool of blood spreading rapidly from his shattered leg. She tore at her skirt, her hands shaking, and pressed the wadded fabric against the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Caleb," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, stay with me." She did not know how long she knelt there, holding him, pressing down on the wound, before she heard the sound of more horses. Her head snapped up, expecting the return of the hired guns, but it was the sheriff and his posse, finally arriving, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm at the scene of carnage before them. "What in God's name happened here?" the sheriff demanded. Dismounting, his hand on his pistol, he looked at the bodies, at the weeping woman, and at the unconscious man at her feet. His face hardened. "So, we have finally caught the kidnapper." "He is not a kidnapper," Clara cried, her voice ragged with grief and fury. "He is a hero. That man," she pointed a trembling finger at Blackwood's body, "is a monster, and he is the one who broke the law." The sheriff scoffed, ready to dismiss her story, ready to fall back on the simple narrative he had been paid to believe. But before he could speak, other figures began to emerge from the woods. The old prospector who had warned them, the blacksmith's daughter, Mary, her face pale but determined. Even the tavern owner from Jasper Creek, drawn by the sound of the shootout. "She is telling the truth, Sheriff," the old prospector said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I saw the warrant. It was a lie. Blackwood owned the law down in Redemption, but he does not own it up here." "I know what he did to his first wife," Mary added, her voice shaking but clear. "Everyone knew. We were just too afraid to say it. Clara was brave enough to run." The tavern owner pointed at Blackwood. "That man's lies got this one here," he said, gesturing to Clara. "Nearly assaulted in my establishment. The man she is with was only defending her." The sheriff looked from the witnesses to Clara, then to the body of the wealthiest man in 3 counties. The simple story of a kidnapper and a hysterical girl was falling apart, replaced by a much more complicated and dangerous truth. The law, faced with the testimony of honest people, was forced to bend. There was no kidnapping. There was only a woman who had run from abuse, and a man who had given her shelter. Caleb survived. It was Lena, the old crow healer, who saved him. She worked for days, using her knowledge of herbs and roots to fight the fever and the infection. But the leg was too badly damaged. He would live, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the price of their freedom. When Caleb was strong enough, Clara's father sent a letter begging her to return home. Silas Blackwood was dead, and with him, the family's debt. She could come back. He wrote. They could forget this whole unfortunate affair. Clara wrote a short, simple letter in response. She would not be returning. Her home was no longer in Redemption. They were married a month later, on the bank of the river where they had made their last stand. It was a quiet ceremony, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Lena stood as their witness, along with the old prospector and Mary, who had stayed to help nurse Caleb back to health. There was no white dress, no pearl buttons. Clara wore a simple blue dress Lena had given her. Caleb stood on a crude crutch, his hand holding hers tightly. They did not exchange rings, they exchanged promises, simple and profound, vows that had already been tested by fire and blood. They were not two halves becoming whole. They were two whole, scarred, and resilient people, choosing to build a new life together. Months later, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, their new life had taken root. They had built a small, sturdy cabin in a hidden valley, miles from Jasper Creek, a place of profound peace and quiet. The cabin was small, but every log had been cut and placed by their own hands. Caleb's limp was pronounced, a constant ache that grew worse in the cold, but he never complained. He could no longer ride the long cattle trails, but he found he had a skill for woodworking, his scarred hands capable of creating beautiful, functional things. A sturdy table, a set of chairs, a cradle that he built with a quiet, hopeful smile. Clara had finally realized her dream. 3 times a week, she rode to the mining camp to teach the children of the prospectors. There was no proper schoolhouse, just a large tent, but to her, it was a cathedral. She taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them to be curious, to be brave, and to tell their own stories. Above the hearth in their small cabin hung the old, heavy wool blanket. It was worn and faded, with a faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and horse. It was the first kindness he had ever shown her, the shelter under which they had hidden, the warmth they had shared. It was a relic of their painful beginnings, and a sacred symbol of their rebirth. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Clara sat on the small porch of the cabin they had built. She had a piece of paper and a pen, and she was writing a new letter. It was not a letter of accusation or a cry for help. It was a letter to Mary, a letter of thanks. She wrote of the goodness of strangers, of the surprising resilience of the human heart, and of the profound peace that comes from carving out a second chance with nothing but grit, pain, and love. She finished writing and looked up, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the jagged line of the mountains. The sky was awash in colors, deep purple, fiery orange, soft rose. Caleb came out of the cabin, moving slowly with his limp, and sat beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. He did not speak, but his presence was a warm, solid comfort. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the clean, cold mountain air. She was not running anymore. She was not hiding. She was simply watching the sunset from the porch of her own home, with the man she loved beside her. She was, at long last, finally home. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.